Good morning. I'm Dusky Terry, President of ITC Midwest. For the third straight year, we are pleased to be the presenting sponsor for the Iowa Ideas Conference and extraordinarily proud of our partnership with the Gazette. As an electric transmission company serving 2/3 of the state, ITC Midwest is invested in and has a very real stake in the future of Iowa. We've supported this conference since its inception because we embrace its mission of gathering hundreds of Iowans together to explore the key questions and the big ideas that will shape the future of our state. ITC Midwest was formed in 2007 to improve electric transmission reliability and increase transmission system capacity in Iowa. And we followed through on that commitment with more than $4.1 billion in capital investments to date. Our investments in the system not only serve the changing needs of customers, they also provide additional capacities to support economic growth and development of low-cost renewable energy resources. Our investments have resulted in a 62% drop in transmission-related outages since ITC acquired the system and began operating it. From extreme weather events such as last year's derecho to the unprecedented transition to renewable energy, from the rapid adoption of electric vehicles to the increasing focus on energy system resilience, the electric utility industry is suddenly in the national spotlight. All of these forces reinforce the critical role of the transmission grid to support the changing landscape and ensure consumers have access to low-cost, clean, and reliable electricity. You know, we often talk about here at ITC about the power of connection, meaning connections are needed to deliver power to communities. There's also tremendous power when people connect to solve problems. Over the next couple of days, I hope you will engage in the breakout sessions, speak up during discussions, and share your ideas to create a brighter future. Open your mind to different points of view as we all work together to come up with the best solutions for making Iowa an even better place now and in the future. I want to thank you for your participation to help shape the future and wish you a great conference.
And thank you for taking some time out to join us at Iowa Ideas 2021. First and foremost, thank you to our presenting sponsor, ITC, and to all of our sponsors that make this possible. Like I said, I'm Brian Bush. I'm with the Gazette. I work with the Gazette and the parent company, the Gazette Foliants, in a couple of capacities. With Iowa Ideas is a huge aspect of that, and then along with our leadership development program, some digital strategy, and a couple of other areas there. I also do some work as a licensed mental health counselor, and that's sort of how I ended up in this panel with Amy, Maggie, and Tony. And thank you to the three of you. We've got a really great panel that brings some really diverse, unique perspective into what we're talking about here. So first, a couple of housekeeping things. For anybody attending, you will not be able to unmute or start your video throughout the session, but we would love your interaction and for you to submit questions as they come up. You'll see in the chat, you can just drop your questions there. They will come to us. And we'll try as hard as possible to get really every one of those introduced to the panel here today and get that addressed, because there's a lot of conversation to be had around the topic that we're talking about here. So before we get into any sorts of questions, Amy, Maggie, Tony, would you mind kind of introducing yourselves? Tell us just a little bit about your background and why you're here today.
I'll start. I'm Maggie Hartzler. I'm with Tanager Place. I've been with Tanager Place since 2006 was when I first started. And I am a licensed independent social worker, and I am the program manager of our school-based program here at Tanager Place. I've worn lots of different hats at Tanager Place, but currently the program manager of the school-based program.
Well, good morning. My name is Amy Doerrfeld, and I work with the Area Substance Abuse Council, or ASAC. I've worked in prevention. I'm a certified prevention specialist, and I've been in this role since 2007.
I'm Tony Wilson, retired educator, presently co-founder of Central City Development Corporation. So we've been working in developing communities for the last 23 years. And I'm here because Quinn is the one who pulls in this, puts you in great situations. So thank you, Quinn. I know she's out there somewhere.
Well, thank you to the three of you for joining. You are here to talk about Beyond Extremes for Youth Services, which obviously is a pretty loaded topic when you think about the just sort of the breadth of what that really means. Tony, I'd like to start with you. You know, when we think about extremes for youth services. It really comes down to really two ends of the spectrum, right? You have on one side sort of young people that don't really need services, and on the other side, kids that are sort of at that point of needing the most intense level of care. But that really does leave this huge gap in between. And I'm just kind of curious from your perspective, when you think about systemically, what is that gap? Why does that gap exist? How do we work with kids where they're at?
I think partially the gap exists because of the stigma that the term mental health carries. A lot of families don't want to get children involved. They don't want to go themselves. And so the stigma is part of it. And I think one of the ways around that is really to start talking about well-being versus mental health, because well-being is something that everybody desires. And I think that's the way to start with a clean slate. And, it's really a public health issue. It's whatever's affecting kids is also affecting adults. And so there's so much stress going on and trauma that, even if you work with the kids and get them straight, they go back home and there's a lot of trauma in the household. So I feel like it really needs to be a community-based initiative where we start working on community well-being and then put resources in place that addresses that. And from all my research, there's some of the health insurance companies are putting out data that says somewhere between 75 and 95% of doctor visits have some kind of basis in stress. So if we can start dealing with the stress that everybody's feeling, kids, adults, everybody, if you work in the schools, you'll look at kids are stressed, but so are the teachers. And so how do we, really start working on stress and mediating that? And so that's where our focus has been, and we've had pretty good luck with that.
Yeah, that's really interesting, especially that stat about doctor visits at 75 to 95% sort of stemming from stress. Maggie, I'm curious, I think you have probably a pretty unique perspective from a community standpoint of what does that look like for when you think about kids, teachers, parents, families, kind of that whole relationship between, how that actually plays out in terms of where we see kids right now.
Yeah, I think right now, obviously, the whole world is very, very stressed. And I think, Tony, you're alluding to this a little bit, like the world has been stressed for a very long time. It's just that now we're seeing it across every single age range, every single social and economic status, every single culture. We are all experiencing this like really intense collective trauma, this collective stress through the pandemic. And so I think right now is like a very opportune time to talk about this, because on some level, every single person has some connection to what this feels like to be so stressed out all of the time. Either they're experiencing it or somebody that they love is experiencing it. And I think what we're seeing in schools and what we have seen in schools for a long time is that we really don't have a good understanding of how stress impacts kids and their bodies and their brains. And we don't have a good understanding of how stress impacts a child's ability to be a learner in a space where they're asked to be a learner. And so when we don't have that understanding, when we don't have an understanding of how that impacts kids, we don't have good plans for how to address it. We don't have good things in place to take care of that. And again, Tony, you talked about educators are also stressed. Same thing. If we do not have a good understanding of how stress is impacting our educators who we're tasking with taking care of our kids, we just have so many things happening here that are just not getting addressed, that we have to start paying attention to, talking about, and really like talking about what's really happening, which is stress in our bodies, stress in our brains.
That is really fascinating. Tony, going back to you on that, can you talk a little bit about that? How do we find that out in terms of what's happening from that stress perspective? How do we learn that? I know you've had some interesting background in research when it comes to this area.
Well, there's when you look at cognitive-based therapy, it really talks about the role of thought in this whole process. And when you look at the science of it, every thought that we think, creates a chemical. So as long as we continue having the same thoughts, we're going to have the same chemicals secreted, we're going to have the same feelings. And so we get caught in this rat race. And then after a while, you become addicted because you get addicted to the hormones of stress. And so until we understand what causes stress and address that, then we just get stuck in this loop of more stress.
Hmm. Yeah. So, Amy, to go over to you, speaking of, Tony mentioned addiction, and I know you certainly have a really, distinct vantage point when it comes to understanding that, the whole world of addiction. Talk to us a little bit about that. How does that play into this state that we're in right now, where there is kind of this gap in terms of services and how a lot of our kids are ending up at this sort of extreme level?
Yeah, I think that, it's been, very concerning just in our world in prevention of just kind of feeling like we know that there's a lot of concerns with substance use during this pandemic. We've seen, increased rates in use. And so, and definitely within our adults, as we're all going through this collective experience of the trauma. And so we know with our youth too, there's a lot of concerns and, especially even with vaping. And so, now more than ever, education and prevention is needed with our youth and our adults, their parents too, so.
Right, and when you say education, I guess talk to us a little bit about that. What are you doing, and I guess what needs to happen from an education standpoint? Because it sounds like from the group that it's really not even just educating one segment, that we might think about, like how do we educate parents versus how do we educate children? It's really kind of a see all of the above, right? But what needs to happen from that perspective?
Yeah, I think that a big part of our work in prevention is, again, we want to provide education across the continuum of ages. So when we do think about our youth, for example, some of that is, just helping them understand the dangers that are associated with substances. Again, there's a lot of misperceptions out there. So just being able to provide those, one-time presentations or evidence-based program. One area that I've, really had a privilege and honor to be involved in is a lot of student advocacy groups that are in schools in the community. And so it's made up of a diverse group of students who really want to make a difference. Some of them maybe have had lived experience, maybe a parent who struggles with a substance use disorder, maybe not, but they're really getting out there, talking to their peers. They're the ones that are going in and talking to the young kids, or they're out in the community doing events to educate the community or talking to legislators, and so we continue to want to be able to do this, that need for, it's had to pivot a little bit, right? Like we haven't been able to be in person with some of our things, but we've been able to do things virtually, and we've seen a lot of students wanting to be involved. They want to be engaged. And so we see that with our youth, but then also with parents. I think there's a big need for education on trends. What's out there? What are we seeing with substances? What to be looking for? And then also being able to help connect people to services as needed. Even talking to one area that we focused on too is, our older populations, maybe grandparents too, as well. A lot of grandparents have helped, especially during this pandemic, with school with their grandchildren. So we think about how important those maybe grandparents or older adults may be also with our youth. So we want to make sure that our services reach everyone.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And along those lines, we've got a good question that came in, and to the people listening, by all means, continue to submit those questions. This one is really interesting. The question is, I'll throw this out for the group and respond as you'd like, but how do we find services that will help facilitate a more natural way to deal with some of these issues when we don't want to just medicate?
It's a really good question. So a lot of what some of us are doing in therapy with individuals is focused on body and movement, because there's a lot of research that shows how crucial it is to use movement and move our bodies and connect our bodies, because when we experience stress or we experience trauma, it really does live in our bodies. And so a lot of therapists right now are approaching their treatment plans with that lens or with that mind frame, that mindset in mind. And so I think that's one of the really powerful ways that we're seeing individuals treat some kids and some families with stress and trauma. Things like EMDR have been really powerful for integrating movement and bilateral stimulation as a more like holistic, natural approach that doesn't necessarily need to involve medication. So that's one way that a lot of therapists are doing right now.
And then I would add, so it's really a body-mind connection. So also meditation and mindfulness is another way really to calm the body down and reduce and eliminate some of that stress. There's a simple breathing technique. There's a process called coherence. It's when you get your mind and your heart in alignment. It's when you're the most centered. And there's simple exercises that could be shared in the community, could be used anywhere to really just have a community-wide approach to reducing stress, which leads to addiction and all the other problems that we have.
Yeah, I think one of the areas that we've done even with some of our youth, but also with adults, is some different campaigns that we've had youth help lead. So thinking about one where it's what's your natural high. So we're really talking about having youth leading out in their communities with ways in which we can engage in natural ways that bring enjoyment in our life, and that looks very different for every person, but helping other kids maybe think about that. So for one, it may be that they love painting or reading or it's running, and so we've had students actually come up with these ideas, put together the campaign, come up with neat messaging, and we've been getting that out. And we've seen a really positive response from that, as well as, even with adults too, just looking at other ways in which, especially when we were, talking about other ways in which we can use instead of medicating with a substance. So.
Okay. And Amy, you've talked a couple times about kids that are getting involved in sort of education by themselves, right? Talking to peers, whether that's in school or other settings. I'm curious for the whole group here, how do we go about getting more kids involved at that level, right? So when they can take ownership over, I have a passion around talking about this and wanting to help my peers. How do we get more kids involved from that standpoint?
Well, I know it's always a big part of it is the awareness, and some of the groups that I've worked with, it's been a little bit more of a struggle just because we did lose some engagement. But then some groups we've seen more kids more than ever because they had this loss of that connection with other humans, and so they do really want to get. So I think a big part of it is the work I get to be involved in is going out and talking to different schools or different community groups and seeing if there are youth, letting them know what we're doing if they want to be involved.
Yeah, I think one of the things from our perspective is, in our program, we have therapists who are in school buildings, right? So that's where they're providing therapy to kids. And I remember being a therapist and walking the halls and seeing one of my clients in the hallway and, having them wave to me. And I remember a conversation that I heard as I was passing, and they had waved and I said, hey, how's it going? And I heard her turn to her friend, and her friend was like, who was that? And she was like, that's my therapist. She's the best. And like through conversations like that, I can't tell you how many times kids have come to our therapist's office and said like, hey, so-and-so says that they see you. And I know that they've felt really heard and like, they really like coming to talk to you. Like, is there any way that I can do that? Like, I have some stuff that I'm dealing with too. And so I think that the more that we can engage kids in the space that they're already in, like, I just feel like there's so much power in that, and so much like they just feel more comfortable in their own spaces. So the more that we can get some of these services into the spaces where kids are actually spending their time, I just think that's a really powerful way to like decrease the stigma, get them more involved, get them to be an advocate. And it can just be really powerful for kids to hear that their peers are seeking some of these services out and that they're feeling good about them. It makes it so much safer to go and ask for that kind of help.
So Brian, I was busy writing this. Go ahead.
No, you're fine. Go right ahead, Tom.
No, I was just saying I was busy writing down some thoughts over here. So if you'd repeat that question, I'd appreciate it.
Well, I'll tell you what, I'm going to repeat it and I'll add to it for you if you don't mind. Because I think Maggie brings up a really good point. We were just talking about how to get kids more kids into the position where they're able to kind of share with peers and sort of get on to that advocacy type level with bringing up this conversation. And what I'd like to add to it is I think you have talked in the past too about that schools, Maggie talks about how do we get into schools where kids are at, and you've talked before about how schools are really good at teaching math and science and reading, but then there can sometimes be this gap when it comes to sort of social emotional learning. And I'm curious, as like what Maggie was talking about, how do we get into the places where our kids are? How do we also go about kind of a cultural shift a little bit in some ways to bring in some of that social and emotional learning into schools?
I think schools are really, they are learning about social emotional learning. I mean, there's a lot of work around it, but it's the application phase part of it that's missing. And there's such a challenge for academics to get to page 17 by November 14th or whatever. So that rush, so we don't take time to establish that sense of well-being, that sense of safety in the classroom, deal with some of those social emotional issues first. Because if we do that, if and when we do that, then we'll actually make up time. But if we don't take time to really deal with those issues up front, and so there's got to be kind of a culture shift in such a way that let's take some time at the beginning of the year to really embed this into our culture. And then as we do that, then we can get back to learning. I was thinking about an analogy. Like sometimes when a class starts, it's like giving a teenager a car and telling them, okay, so meet me in San Francisco. No lessons, no, whatever. And so they take off with many mishaps. But if we would have taken the time to give them some driver's education or life education, they would be much more efficient in their work. So just taking some time, slowing down enough to work on the mindfulness, the social emotional stuff before we start, and make sure it's just embedded into everything we do. Because you can embed all that stuff into each subject.
Amy, Maggie, I'm curious about your thoughts when it comes to that, just in terms of how to, that sort of that shift in terms of maybe slight, maybe big. I don't know. What does that shift look like from a meeting kids at the school level where they spend most of their time?
Yeah, I think that, Tony, you talk about the opportunities that they have to embed some of that social emotional learning into every single lesson, every single thing that we're doing. That is 100% being taught to teachers. Like there's all of that that's being taught to teachers to do that, and an emphasis on that. But I think it's hard to know how to do that. Even if you're being taught that, it is hard to know how to manage your emotions. It is hard to know how to regulate your stress. It is hard to do those things. And it is hard for us as adults to do that. So it's really hard for us to teach children how to do that. I think some of what we are dealing with here is that we have not, as a society, valued some of this for a really long time. And what we have from that is a whole bunch of adults who struggle with managing their emotions, regulating their stress, regulating their bodies. And so then asking these adults to then teach kids how to do that is a little bit like asking somebody who has not taken driver's ed to teach the kids how to drive a car, right? And so I think that it really does need to be a cultural shift of how we talk about wellness, how we talk about what it means to be a whole, functioning, healthy individual. And what that means is truly taking care of our emotional space, our emotional energy, our bodies, our mind, our soul, our spirit, right? All of those things. And that just has not been what society has taught us about what it means to be a successful person. And so I think that the shift is I think, really monumental. Like, we have to do so much work on so many different levels to really like get kids and adults into a space where this is possible. And I'll interject one more thing. I'm so sorry, Amy. Last thing.
No, go ahead.
I think that as an adult, like, it's taken me lots of work to be able to do some of these things. Like, therapy is a wonderful, beautiful tool for every single person on this planet. It should be something that is talked about as regularly as a PCP checkup, right? Like, it is a lot of work for anybody to do this and to do it well and to normalize that it is work. Sorry, Amy, go ahead.
No, you're fine. I was really just going to echo everything that both you and Tony have mentioned. I think even just for my own, being in this helping profession in the middle of the pandemic, there has just been so much more awareness and education. And I myself have been learning so much, and you think, like, kind of speaking to that cultural shift, this wasn't being talked about. And so, again, to your point, Maggie, I mean, I think all of us as adults having that opportunity to learn and understand, we need to be able to do that. And then also that will then be a ripple down effect for our children and youth as well. And so I am excited, though, that there has been this shift, because it's so needed. And especially with those who are in those helping professions, but really everybody, but just like how much that is going to be needed. And as a culture, if we can continue to embrace that, we're going to be so much better off.
Yeah, and speaking of that, Maggie, maybe I'll throw this out to you here, and then just kind of open this up. But I'm curious, when you think about, the extremes that we're talking about, right, of needs when it comes to mental health in our youth, that spectrum of needs is really broad, right? I mean, when we go from point A to point Z, and when we think about that spectrum, how do we create a system that allows for the easiest and most direct access to support and to care that's needed, regardless of where a young person is at on that spectrum?
Yeah, so I feel like that's a super loaded question, right? Like, there's so many pieces of things to think about with that. And so I'm just going to speak from like the experience that I've had in this program and the success that I've seen in this program. And I do believe that schools are our ticket to offering this wide spectrum of support, right? Like, schools already do this really well. They have a really wide spectrum of support for like learners, right? For like reading. So if I have struggles with reading and I'm over at point A, there's support that exists for me in that environment. If I'm a successful reader and I'm over here and I've surpassed every reading level, there's support for me over there too, right? So like, schools are actually really good at saying, here's a whole bunch of different learners at a whole bunch of different places, and we're going to teach them and we're going to have supports for them as far as education goes, right? But that's not necessarily true for mental health. And I think that with the structure of schools, of knowing all of these kids who come into their building, having relationships with these kids, having relationships with their families, schools know which kids are struggling most of the time, right? There's some that can fly under the radar, but for the most part, schools know, somebody in that school knows if a kid is struggling. And so I think that building a system within that school system to say, here are mental health services, here are mental health supports, here's linkage to other mental health resources and supports in the community of all different various, need levels. That's probably one of the most successful ways that I can think of and that I have seen get kids access to the support and services that they need.
I was just listening to Maggie talk, and I think that we would be wise if we created a course, it would be called Life 101. So we teach children, all children, how mindfulness and how to deal with stress and all that. So it's actually a focus of a class where they're given the tools that they need to work through this. But it's got to be something that's either over long term or something that's really concentrated, so they get the tools that they need. I wrote a book called "You Are Enough" that I use. I talked to some human service classes at BMAC in Des Moines, and at the end of I always go in and have a conversation with them afterwards. And the one thing they keep saying, I wish somebody would have taught us this earlier. And so I think we need to very specifically teach kids the tools, and it may need to be a separate class.
I would absolutely be supportive of that. I would attest to the same thing. It would be nice to have that earlier, wouldn't it? Amy, I'm curious on your end, if we're talking about schools and really sort of trying to infuse this into educating our young people from a mental health perspective, how do other agencies fit into that? When I think about things like ASAC or doctor's offices, primary care physicians, Tanager place, all of these other places, organizations, platforms, resources, support that exist. How do we all kind of work together when it comes to really allowing our kids access to the care that they need?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I know just from my experience, I mean, we're always really trying to build relationships with schools, obviously, because we know that they do see our youth and often do know about the services that are needed. So making sure they're aware of the different supports out there and how to access them. Because I know a lot of times there are parents who, are just unaware of how they can. And so they're reaching out. But I think that, like you mentioned, also looking outside of the school and thinking about those other trusted professionals or organizations where youth might be. So doctors, other youth serving organizations, could be faith-based organizations, other community coalitions that are working to address youth substance use, mental health, really trying to get that information out there. So there are easy ways for parents and youth to get access to services. And so I've seen that to be just a powerful way, especially even in the work with coalitions of just all these organizations coming together and collaborating and working, because really we all are, in this together. We are all interconnected in the work that we're doing. And really, truly, the goal is to have, healthy children and families and thriving communities. So we want to be connected however we can to support our youth and community.
So I think this whole issue is a public health issue. And I know Lynn County Health Department, I think, would be a good place to help us make this a community-wide, a county-wide movement. And so, the kids are just a symptom of the problem. So if we don't focus on everybody, which includes teachers and therapists, and because I did some training also around that. I work with people who are providing therapy to have a class for them to work through some issues too. And so, we all need that. And so you can focus on kids, that's one, but there's a public health crisis that we need to resolve. And I think by doing it community-wide, we can have the biggest impact.
It brings up a really interesting point. I'm curious, Maggie, if I throw this back to you, you brought up or mentioned at one point kind of the stigma around this whole conversation. And I'm curious what you see when you do think about all the, at the community level, when you think about agencies and teachers and doctors' offices and all of these other, Tony talks about how many, just the scope of people that need to be involved in this conversation. Does that stigma play a role at that level? Like, do you see that when it comes to primary care physicians or teachers or other, people that we otherwise might need on board when it comes to this, goal of helping our young people?
Yeah, what's interesting is young people right now are just like the most open, accepting, affirming generation I think we've ever had, right? Like, so I don't see as much of the stigma from our young people. And I don't think that plays in as much for them. I'm sure there are still some kids, right, that stigma, they struggle with that. But there's a lot of kids where the conversation really is, it's okay to not be okay, right? Like, kids are very accepting of differences and just other people, other perspectives, other experiences. I think that really the stigma is probably lives more with us in our older generations, that we need to do a little bit of work around where that comes from for us, what that means for us, and how that's playing a role in the services that kids have access to. I think that primary care physicians probably and pediatricians really probably have a lot of pull with parents to explain some of this stuff and explain how our brains work and why we might need support and need extra help. And I don't know if pediatricians are doing a ton of that. I think I don't know a lot of pediatricians or primary care physicians who are asking what a kid or a family's ACE score looks like, or asking what kind of trauma or stress they've experienced. Taking my own kids to the doctor, I get asked 2 questions every time about stress, like what's your stress level? And, and that's really it, which you can miss a lot of people with just asking what, are you stressed out? A lot of people are saying, oh no, this is normal. This is my life. But so I think that we have some work to do with older generations around mental health needs and what that means if you have some needs to support your mental well-being. But kids, man, they're the best. They're so accepting and open and inclusive and affirming. They're awesome. We should learn from them.
In culturally, if you look at the different cultures, I think some are more open to mental health assistance than others too. So we have to take that into account as we're doing this work. That's why I say, changing the name to well-being and having a well-being index. I mean, that's something that I think that would remove that stigma and help us move forward.
Yeah, that's even been a conversation in my area of language, as you mentioned that. I mean, when you think about how language truly does matter and the words that we use and the words that we say. And so even with that, there's a shift in how we talk about things and what we call it. And that is encouraging that we are starting to have more of that shift, but there's a lot of work to be done.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think too, Tony, when you talk about, talking about mental well-being, I think that could address some of these extremes, right? Like if more people and more kids were saying, or more families were saying, my kid needs a little bit of support with their mental well-being. I'm going to get them in to see a therapist. I'm going to get them in for this service, whatever it might be, right? And essentially like treat some of that before it gets to a place where it's a complete crisis, right? Then it's a mental health crisis. So instead of addressing things just when they become a crisis, it's looking at how do I support my kid in increasing their mental well-being and what that looks like. And I think that if we could do that, you would see a shift in these extremes. You would see more people getting services at a point that's not a crisis and fewer people needing services for crisis situations.
And having some kind of assessment. I mean, how do we catch these things early so that we can address them before they do become a crisis?
Yeah, and a lot of schools are doing things like youth mental health first aid, which I think is just incredible, like an incredible use of professional development time and dollars to educate teachers on what they should even be looking for when they're trying to figure out who needs mental health support and who doesn't. And what does that look like in my classroom? And what do I do with that? What do I say? How's that conversation supposed to go? So I think there is certainly, we are on the track, right? We see that it's a need. It just doesn't move as fast as we want it to. We want to go a lot faster.
For sure, that's always the battle, right? It'd be nice to speed things up sometimes. I'm curious, Tony, do you see other barriers to that in terms of making that happen or speeding that process up a little bit? Are there barriers that exist that may be preventing that?
No, I think it's awareness or just a shift in focus. I know the keynote talked about, with Viktor Frankl, it's the focus where we focus our energies, where we're going to get our attention. So as soon as we focus on community well-being or health and well-being, I think people will, as they begin to understand it, they'll jump on the bandwagon. But it's just a matter of focus.
I think too, there's always like the barrier of funding and dollars and policy and those kinds of things. certainly can make it a lot harder to do some of this work if there's not dollars put towards mental health services and supporting, these kinds of things in schools. Then it's really hard to do the good work that we know we need to do if we don't have like the policy and the finances behind it. So there is a piece where we all need to advocate for policies that will put dollars into this work.
Yeah, that advocate word I think is really interesting. And if you don't mind, I'll just sort of throw that back out to the group. I'm curious from an advocacy standpoint, what can, the people that are on this call listening, what can people do from an advocacy standpoint?
I think in order to advocate for well-being, you have to work on your own personal well-being. So really start working on self-care. What do they need to do to get themselves in a state where they, because when in stress, when they talk about fight, flight, or freeze, when you're in that stressful mode, then you really can't think clearly. You not going to come up with the solutions that you need. And so until you can mediate that and get yourself to a place of calm, then that's when the creative ideas come forward. So it starts with self-care, and then as you do that, then start building a community of individuals around you who are in agreement.
Yeah, I think also it is our responsibility to ask legislators what their stances are on supporting mental health and how they plan to do that. And I think it's also our responsibility to do some education of legislators and say, like, this feels like a real problem in our state, in our community, in our country. And how are you going to help make this better? What is your plan for making things better in our communities? And they might not have a plan, but I think it's our responsibility to ask that question. And if they don't have a plan, at least asking the question is going to say, this is something I need to be thinking about. This is something that people care about and people want to see efforts put towards. So I love to call my legislators and ask questions and advocate for different things. And I think every person should get comfortable with doing that and finding the things that they're passionate about and making those phone calls. It's very easy. The staffers are always usually nice to me. So
Mostly.
Yeah, I think that we have definitely seen, that need again for that education and talking with legislators. We've also had opportunities for students who are involved in advocacy efforts to, we talk to them like, what are your concerns? What are you seeing? What do you care about? What are you passionate about? What changes do you want? And allowing them opportunities to engage with legislators. And we've seen that to be a really powerful way for them to learn about it, to not be scared to pick up the phone and call. But, I always say that, having a student talk to a legislator can be so much more powerful than me coming, and doing that. So I think that's one way.
Absolutely. Kids' voices are really powerful in that space.
Yeah, that's good insight. We have another question that came in. It says, will these services be offered via telehealth? Doing all the appointments can get overwhelming. I'm curious what all of you think about that when we talk about this, the scope of care that we're trying to reach with young people.
Well, I can talk about that a little bit. And actually, telehealth. So COVID, obviously, so many awful things came from COVID. But one of the really amazing things that came from COVID was really our ability to increase our increased access to these services through telehealth. And so if you would have asked me 20 months ago or however many months ago, if I thought, a 6-year-old should have telehealth therapy, I would have said, oh my gosh, no, like get them in person, like that's ridiculous. But having seen the training and education and having provided supervision and clinical supervision to people who are doing that work every day, I 100% changed my tune on that. Like, there is beautiful therapy happening for kids virtually, and kids are really comfortable on like a FaceTime kind of thing. That's how they talk to their peers. That's how they connect and engage with the world, is virtually. And so they're really good at it, actually. So telehealth can absolutely help with increasing access to care. And I think, again, still, like, having a lot of it hubbed in a school also really just helps keep things like happening. So a teacher can say, hey, I know you have your 2 o'clock appointment. Do you want to go to the guidance office or wherever and do your 2 o'clock appointment? And the kid can pull up their device and go wherever they want to go to be in a private space and do their 2 o'clock appointment and then just come back into class, right? So I think it just opens a lot of doors for increasing access for a lot of different things, even just like even a doctor's visit. You can pull up your primary care doctor on your phone and get some support pretty quick. So I think it's an incredible outcome from COVID.
Another outcome would be that there are a lot of families that didn't have access to technology pre-COVID. And now almost every student has a laptop that they take home with them, which means the family has access to more services. So that's another positive outcome. And I do a lot of training, and I wondered if I could do that and still have the same effectiveness via Zooms. And it was really amazing. Is once you really establish that connection, then there's a lot that can be done. So actually, that's one of the positives that came out of COVID, is, the expanded access to technology.
Yeah, I would just echo that. I mean, it's been amazing to see how telehealth and other virtual ways in order to provide services has really decreased barriers and expanded an opportunity to sometimes reach people that you may not have been able to reach. And so, for us, seeing telehealth as a positive thing, as well as just even in being able to do presentations and trainings and meetings virtually. I can think of some of the grandparents in some of our coalitions who are passionate about youth and making our communities better, who weren't able to come to the meetings in person during COVID, but they were able to join virtually. And so I just think that, we have seen that it has been a positive thing that has come from COVID, allowing us new and creative ways to offer programming and services.
And another thing about telehealth is that it's delivered in homes. And so it's a safe place. And so versus going into a strange office, so people have a comfort level. There's a concept that we talk about in all of our work called sanctuary, which was creating an environment where people feel safe, cared for, free to express themselves. So that's something that we could do, in our families, in the schools, everywhere, is to make sure that our environment is a safe environment where you lessen the stress response and fight, flight, or freeze. And once you do that, then that's when a lot of the learning and the growth takes place.
Yeah, for sure. And that actually, that's a really good segue to a question that just came in. And we've got about 4 minutes left here. So I'm going to pair this with sort of a final question that I think goes really well together. Because the reality is, even with all the prevention efforts in the world and the access to care, there's still, wrenches get thrown in when we think about things like the pandemic, the derecho that happened, and all of the other kinds of trauma that happen, even in spite of all of our best efforts, right? That we know a lot of kids in our communities are dealing with trauma. The question that came in through the audience here is there a way to reset our brain to stop depending on that stress? I will pair that, because I think it goes pretty well with, if there was one thing that each of you just kind of want to leave this group with as a takeaway of what they can do, I would love for you to share that. And we'll take maybe a minute each as we kind of wrap up here.
Yeah, well, I'll start with that, resetting our brain. I think that's a lot of therapy, is resetting our brain. And I talk about it in terms of creating new neural pathways and strengthening adaptive neural pathways. And so really, it's like you have to have new experiences to create some new neural pathways. And then you have to strengthen those neural pathways. So I would not be doing this work if I did not believe that it was possible to reset our brain and heal from that trauma. And so absolutely, it's possible. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of time. It's a lot of energy. It's a lot of heartache sometimes, but 100% possible. And then as far as what I really would like take away from today, I think one of the things that I would take away from today is that none of this works without each one of us doing some of this work of taking care of ourselves and healing some of the things that have been traumatic or stressful in our own lives so that we can then continue to care for others. I think that that is probably the most important message that everybody needs to walk away with, is that I can be part of the solution as long as I am well enough to participate. And so I have to start by getting myself well enough so that I can help young people, help my family, help my children, help my neighbors, because we all have that power to really be a very healing, very positive influence in the world. And so that is what I would take away today.
So can you do something? So there's something called neuroplasticity, which says your brain is very plastic. And so neurons that fire together, wire together. And as long as you keep thinking the same thoughts and experience the same thing, your brain just maintains that pathway. And when you shift your focus to something else, you start building new neural pathways. So it all goes back, all goes back to what you're thinking, the power of thought. And so, yes, there's hope.
Yeah, I think that was the word that just came to my mind, was resilient, building resiliency and hope. And I think that can be so important in our own lives, right? So like what Maggie said, as far as really being well ourselves, but also just how important relationships are, that ability to have human connections. And so looking at how that is, whether it's for your own self, but also for our youth, and just finding ways to be a positive influence in the lives of youth and other people can make all the difference.
Yeah, that is really fascinating to hear the perspective of the role that we all play in the mental health and well-being of the children in our communities. I think is really eye-opening always for me to that reminder of how much of a crossover there is, right? The responsibility and the opportunity I think that we all have. So Amy, Maggie, Tony, thank you so much for joining on this panel, for sharing your expertise, your perspectives. I think it's incredibly beneficial and extremely needed. So thank you. We'll let everybody get going here. To the audience, thanks for joining. Next up, obviously lunch, get some food, get re-energized, and then we'll have another speaker here this afternoon. So thanks everybody for joining. Hopefully you continue to enjoy Iowa Ideas, and we'll see everybody soon.
Thank you.